Hello, can people hear me?
Here.
I can hear you.
Okay, good. I'm just trying to organize myself to present slides. Haven't done this week yet, so just give me a few moments. Do people see the first slide?
Yes, we do.
We do, Alexei.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
My apologies for asking so many times. Right, let's get started. This is Email Core BOF. I'm Alexei Melnikov and Seth Blank we are two co-chairs for the BOF. We'll quickly go through administrivia and other things and then get going with the meat of the BOF. So this MeetEcho, we're using MeetEcho this time. This MeetEcho session is being recorded. If you just got the slides, you have a link. You have a Jabber room. If you log into Jabber, you will show up in MeetEcho chat box and vice versa. And we have a shared note-taking CodeMD that replaces other part. Bron has agreed to be our note taker. Thank you, Bron. If you are new, Email Core is a part of IETF. We're covered by NodeWeld, which covers IPR and other things. This is a short reminder of various NodeWeld issues. And other things to note is just please be respectful to other participants. Even if discussions get heated, they can still be respectful. And if you want to read a bit more, you have a list of RFCs and BCPs. Agenda. So chairs will quickly introduce the problem statement. Then we talk about three types of documents, and we'll explain the difference between them. One is 5322 revision, one 5321 revision, and then core ML applicability statement. The discussions will affect what exactly ends up being in the charter. So that's why we're spending so much time discussing various issues or potential issues. We are not planning to resolve all of them. Sometimes it's just triage, just to sort of get an idea what kind of issues we might run into in the working group. And then we'll go through the charter, proposed charter text. Oh, and my apologies, actually, on the slide, proposed charter scope is going to be 5 minutes and charter review is going to be 25 minutes, not the other way around. Any agenda bashing? Did you hear me talking for the last 5 minutes? Excellent. Right. Okay. So I wasn't just talking to myself. So I'm good to hear that. Right. Let's start with the BOF itself then. Problem statement. So we all use email. It's what we know it's widely used. We had RFC 821 and 822, which are the best well-known, and they're internet standards. We revised them once to become 2821 and 2822. Then end up being proposed standards. But we when I say we here is the community, revised them again to become 5321 and 5322, and they're draft standards. Now, the process has changed. Draft standards doesn't exist as a level anymore. So the proposal on the table is to revise them to become internet standards. This sounds very easy, doesn't it? Well, probably it isn't, but let's try to discuss specific details. So proposed scope is, there are so many email standards that if we start doing everything, we'll just try to boil the ocean and we don't get anywhere. So proposal is to start with the two main documents, no major surgeries, no rewrites of them. And as per requirements for moving documents to internet standard, we can take the stuff out and either delete it completely or move it to the proposed applicability statement BCP document that we'll talk about later. At this point, different people asked for various things. We don't propose to include internationalized email at the moment, just because it's not the same level of maturity. And as much as we would like to revise MIME, this is yet another 4, 5, 6 documents, and we should do this at a later point.
Great.
So,
And yep, and I'll take this slide. So our proposal as chairs is that we review for these 3 documents, right, the existing errata, other known issues, and Barry, you want to say something? So aren't?
Yes, I just
Barry?
wanted to highlight on Alexei's previous, what Alexei previously said, that the main goal right now, for the initial bit here is to correct the anomaly that the two obsolete specs, 821 and 822, are at a higher standard level than the current standard is. And so that's the reason for keeping changes minimal and just getting that anomaly corrected and trying to defer whatever changes we want to make beyond that to the applicability. That's all I wanted to highlight.
Thank you, Barry. And so just to keep us on time, I'm going to do this proposal relatively quickly because we'll get into the meats in a second. But basically, we want to address existing errata and known issues and revise 3 documents, right? We want to do the 5321 BIS, 5322 BIS, and then the core email applicability statement. It could be a BCP. What we call the thing is less important than it's the place for understanding issues that are cross-cutting and that may not need to live in either 5321 BIS or 5322 BIS, but need to exist as part of the revision process to bring those 2 documents to Internet Standard. And again, to Alexi's point about restricted scope, we can't triage everything, but we do want to discuss what we need to on the mailing list. And we do expect to have most of the conversation today to be about the scope for these documents and what this group believes should and should not be in them. And so we're really looking to find the rough consensus of everyone here. So please speak up, use the mic as we go through this. And then from the output, what we believe is in and out of scope, then we'll go through the charter and make sure the rough consensus is reflected. So Alexi, next slide.
Right, and so we want to start with 5322. And Pete, would you like to talk about the changes you've done so far?
Sure. And let's see. Am I being heard well?
You are.
Reasonably,
Excellent.
yes.
All right. So 5322, I am hoping, is going to be the simpler of the documents to deal with. I've already put in a bunch of errata changes. If you take a look at the current draft of 5322 BIS, you'll notice that all but 3 of the changes from 5322, which I've listed in the last section there, are all fixes from reported errata. So, except for 3, those are a typo, some changes to the references, and a small change to the message ID syntax to split it up so that it's in smaller pieces. That leaves me with only 3 errata that are waiting to be fixed. We've got one in section 3.6, the header field length limit, which is basically someone reported there is no current limit on the number of characters in a header field name. And should we put that into the syntax? And I was ambivalent about doing that because it might affect other things. There was the last one, which is simply putting a count on the recent fields and whether that would be problematic or potentially change things. And then there's the empty quoted string. Let me get back to the empty quoted string in a moment. The other 2 seem to me fine to make the change if we can figure out how to do it safely. On the other hand, I don't think there's been any particular note that these things have caused implementation problems. So one question is, yeah, technically we could put in more clear ABNF, but we don't want to mess things up, and we've got a current document that seems to be implemented well. As far as the empty quoted string, this may impact 5321 BIS as well. There's the question of, do we want to allow for such things, which the 5322 syntax allows much more and addresses than 5321. And we've noted that in both documents for, the many years that we've had them, which is 5322 allows a more liberal syntax and 5321 limits it. One thing with the empty quoted string is it makes for a mysterious address coming over to 5321 if you've used one of those in your headers in 5322. And the question is, do we want to deal with that? All three of these seem to be the sticky points, but none of them are exciting. And so what I need, excuse me, for the 5322 BIS document is review the changes that I've made so far and get some recommendations for these three remaining errata. And then I think 5322 BIS is pretty much done. Anybody have questions about that?
Just jumping in quickly, as an individual, is I have actually seen an operational problem with the header field name length. There was an issue in Open DKIM for, I think, a decade with a buffer overflow that lived for a very long time that no one hit until there were some larger messages recently. And it caused some interrupt problems. It was mostly hidden, but it was a big deal and had to get fought quickly.
People were using a longer than 77 character header field name.
Yeah, it blew out 1,024 characters, and that's when things went to hell.
Oh, but that was not the proposal for the change. It was simply the header field name length.
Oh, the field name. You're right.
Yeah. So anyway, Dave, you had a question? Dave keeps popping in and out. You can just push play and start speaking.
Oh, there we go. I think I'm on now. Yes.
Yep.
Sorry about the confusion. So I put this into the Jabber. I'll raise it. It's always been bothersome that there are two places that define an email address. Seems to me not too traumatic for the goals here to change it so that there's only one place and the other one just points to it.
Yep. And the only trauma is at this point in history, changing the documentation, in a way that might cause some disruption. And that's a very nebulous kind of concern. So in general, I agree with you. But do we want to go down that path? And could we conceive of someone is using the more liberal syntax in 5322 in some way that's never getting through to 5321? I can't think of one, but.
I thought I heard a goal here of reconciling the disparity between the two. This is merely a way of doing that makes sure it continues forward.
Right. And I will repeat that for all three of these things, for the most part, the reason they are still in there is because your dutiful document editor was ambivalent about what the right solution was and would rather leave it to someone else to make the call.
Hey, it's Brian Gondwana here. I'm in favor also of having a single specification. The question I'm wondering is, should this be a separate document that just specifies that and is referred to by both of these? Or are you suggesting sticking it into one of these and then referencing that from the other?
And the only argument I would have for leaving it in here is there's so much of the sub-syntax of addresses that 5322 defines, like the sub pieces of the ABNF, that might be difficult to tease out, but it's a possible solution.
Yeah. Everyone, please use the queue to speak. We've got too many people who are going in, and if one of the chairs or presenters is accepting people, let's please not leave them in the queue and let's call people one by one and announce who we're accepting, please. And I think there were several people, but I think John Clenson was first, and then Barry.
Yeah, just remember two things as we're thinking about this. One of them is that there are already many cross-references, typically between 5321 and 5322, but maybe not exclusively, where we have tried to reconcile differences by pointing from one to the other. The other thing to remember is that whatever we do, we probably cannot completely harmonize these to address syntaxes because 5322 permits the notorious name phrase and 5321 does not. And allowing the name phrase in SMTP would be really disruptive. So we can't get complete harmony even if we can harmonize the mailbox names. The other observation I would make is if we want to unify these things at this stage of the game, we should probably unify them using the AI model, bringing a third piece in the puzzle rather than unifying these two, but not that one. I'm not opposed to doing this. I'm just afraid we may cause ourselves more problems than we really want.
Yep. I think, Barry, you were next.
So my suggestion was to, yes, I agree that it would be good to merge them. I agree that it would probably be best to put them in 5322. To clearly mark any additional stuff we want 5322 to have as to mark that part of the syntax separately, so it's clear that this is only used in message body or in message format and not on the wire in SMTP, and perhaps to deprecate it, just as we did with the obsolete constructs in the 2321. 2821 and 5321.
Yeah, 22 you meant, but yes, absolutely. Yeah, we've got that option. Victor.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, just fine.
Okay. One thing that I used to run into a bunch in 5322, I don't know how much of a problem it still is I've seen user agents failing to fold the references header, making it grow longer and longer and longer until the physical line exceeds 998 bytes, and then various MTAs would start folding it, but not necessarily at the expected boundaries between elements. Not everybody's that clever. And then the thing starts becoming a soup of bad syntax. Right. It would be nice to recommend that the thing be strictly folded at each new added reference, so that whatever logical length limit it might ultimately hit by the time there are 1,000 replies or something, at least as each one is being added, it's not going to push the line limit because it's strictly folded. I don't know if that's the kind of thing that belongs at this stage in 5322, but it might add a little bit of interoperability in that header. Because it's the one thing that keeps growing and growing as messages go round and round.
So
within that header.
So let me make a suggestion along those lines, because that sounds like clarification text, which may be reasonable. And the way that I remember one particular, as we were going along, someone reported something, can you just throw this in? And my suggestion was, go ahead and put it as an editorial errata or something, if you can figure out a way to do that, and say, this was not clear in the original document. It would normally, I think, have been flagged, and the current AD can confirm this for me, would be flagged as hold for document update, because it wasn't a change that necessarily was, yes, that's a clear intention that the working group originally had, or something like that. And then, we can mark it as fixed once we get it done. that at least has been the way I've been running this, although a short clarification doesn't seem to violate the moving things to internet standard process. So I'm open to whatever the AD wants to do on this, but that seems like at least one way to go.
Okay, I can file an erratum.
Because all you want is a short note which just says, these must be folded at whatever boundary.
Well, really between each element, right, of the references list.
Right. Okay.
So that you don't keep growing towards some bound that isn't necessarily well implemented.
And I think going through places where there have been implementation problems, especially if they're just clarifications, would probably be in scope for what we're doing. But yeah, let's try and figure out if we can do something like that.
Okay. The other thing I don't know is some people seem to think that the individual header line, not the field name, but the individual header lines are, somehow really restricted to the 72, 78, whatever characters one typically expects for message body. But in fact, we can go up to about the 998 plus CRLF without too much trouble. I don't know if that's clear enough in the document. But certainly when we're generating things like received headers and the like, and we're putting host names in there, those can easily blow out 98 characters by the time you have a full internet domain name, perhaps repeated more than once in a received header. It easily approaches 1,000 bytes, but
and
not.
You're talking about folded or unfolded?
Even in a single component, right? That you can't fold, a lexical thing like received from, boom, host name that's 200 bytes. And where do you fold that?
And we're at time, so this sounds like it's definitely worth discussing on the list.
Yeah,
okay.
So I think for both of these, at least post a message to the list, and we'll get to which list in a bit. And let's talk about whether we should file them as errata. These don't sound completely like errata, but whether that's a good bookkeeping.
I think they're both clarifications. I don't think they change the spec.
I don't think they do either. So, all right, yeah, that sounds good.
All right.
Thanks.
All right, thank you, Pete. And now we're going to move on to 5321. And we have a couple, we have more issues for 5321, so we'll just triage some of them. Again, we don't have to make a decision here on specific resolution. John, would you like to talk about quoted strings?
Yeah. I want to repeat a comment I made several times on the list, which is that with regard to most of the things in Appendix G, I'm just acting as a recording clerk rather than somebody advocating any of them. And there are a few there that we may get to today, but we'll certainly get to on the list that I would privately oppose, but I try to keep that text minimal, neutral, and people should understand that. With this particular one, we've noticed over the years that the quoted string syntax in SMTP, at least, gets tied up with various things in various operating systems, which do their own quoting and unquoting, or think that quotes belong to them, or that single quotes versus double quotes, or double quotes versus single quotes have special syntax. And as a consequence, things get quoted and unquoted, and nobody knows what they mean. Regardless of whether the specs are clear, there's been confusion over the years about whether a space needs a backslash quote if the whole string is inside double quotes or not. There are some funny interactions with mail to URIs and what that syntax means as illustrated by the example at the bottom, and the fact that the backslash may or may not need to be does not need to be there, given what's in 5321 and 5322, and a variety of other things. So the question is whether this is causing, at this stage in the development of email and the internet, enough confusion and complication in real life implementations that we either should take it out entirely, or should somehow strip it down to make it less complicated and easier to explain. And this obviously interacts with the harmony between the address syntaxes of the two specs, and so on. So that's an explanation of the issue. Again, at the moment, taking no particular position on whether we should do something or not, but noting that this is also one of the cases where we need to be aware that there are gateway systems that transport mail headers just fine, but may not use SMTP for all of their lifespans, and that may interact with this a little bit. Lexi, back to you.
Right. Anybody else wants to comment about this? We don't need to make a decision now, but if people have feelings one way or the other. Victor?
Sure. I think spaces have worked well enough over the years that I don't see a need to require backslashes. That seems a radical departure. Mind you, in postfix, which I work on from time to time, if you put two spaces in, they may collapse to one, but that's a bug, not two consecutive ones. I think postfix actually temporarily splits and then rejoins such things in the recipient and mail commands, though I may be misremembering. And the rejoining inserts one space. So maybe addresses with two spaces would at the moment cause an interoperability problem, but if they do, and it becomes a problem in practice, it's a bug for us to fix. I don't view it as requiring any special treatment in the spec.
All right, thank you, Victor. John, very quickly, and then we need to move on to the next one. John, another John.
Can you hear me? I don't see my
Yes.
thing.
Yes.
Okay. Briefly, this is one of the many things that if we were doing this from scratch, I would do it differently, but we've lived with it for 30 years, and I don't think we should. I don't see any benefit to trying to change it now.
Right. Thank you. Next issue. So when you see G dot something on the slide, it means that it's from John's appendix. G. Does anybody want to talk about 1YZ reply codes? Sorry, I'm trying to.
Yeah, are they ever used in the wild?
Or actually, Harold's trying to share his screen, but not audio. So Harold, audio would be useful if you want to talk.
I'm trying to compute the. Oh, this seems right. So now, are one IZ code ever used in the wild? And if not, should we care?
Yeah, this was proposed on the mailing list that there might be some use, but there is no document at the moment. So I think for this one, suggestion probably will be taken to the mailing list, ask proponents to publish at least a draft, and then we can discuss. If there is no draft, then we'll just not, this is not going to be done.
I don't
All right.
think widespread practice for the 100s anyway, so they shouldn't be part of a full standard. Go away.
Right. Okay. Now we are moving to the suggested core email applicability statement. The proposal on the table is that it's best practices for use of SMTP. Email format may be MIME. Suggestion is not to say anything about POP, IMAP, JMAP, or CIV. We do have actually several separate working groups for IMAP, CIV, and JMAP anyway, so let's not boil the ocean. Suggestion, let's not touch SMTP submission because it's already full standard, I believe. We might or might not mention practices like DMARC, DKIM, and SPF. They do have DMARC is, however, a separate working group, so which is revising DMARC BIS. So all the work on DMARC itself and possibly DKIM SPF should happen there. So with that in mind, just another quick warning or note. This is a proposal strawman from chairs. We put a lot of issues raised against 5321 BIS into the applicability statement bucket. If you don't agree, and this is a really issue that needs addressing with 5321 BIS, say so. It's okay to disagree with us. So let's see some issues now.
Okay, and then Alexei, before we move on, Dave wants to speak.
Fine.
Dave?
Yes, thank you. So applicability statements are things that always have very strong intuitive appeal. It's never clear to me how useful they actually are. But independent of any of that, this would be new work, and including it at this point seems like an addition that isn't necessary for moving the other specs to full standard. And so I suggest taking this out of the critical path of that effort.
Yes, I think the idea is for if there are some practice, like for example, 5321 BIS can have some syntactic restrictions, which is quite, or specify syntax, which is quite liberal, and then there are some practices saying that in reality you should use a more restricted subset. That kind of thing we can have an applicability statement. And yes, we can move the two main documents to internet standard quicker before we finish the applicability statement.
And Pete, you wanted to jump in? Pete? Okay, well, we wait for Pete. Barry?
Well, so the intent here is that specifically the applicability statement will not get in the way of the other documents, that the proposed charter text says that the moving 5321 and 5322 to internet standard comes first. and work on the applicability statement is after that.
Yeah, and I further believe that the point of the applicability statement is really to make it easier to simplify 5321, 5322, not to make it more complicated. And Pete, were you about to say something?
Yeah, and this may have been in some way said by others, but to put a point on it, when Alexi and Seth mentioned this idea in the first place, this seemed to me that this was a document that would be, at least the internet draft form, a dumping grounds for this really doesn't belong in 5321 bis or 5322 bis, or can be removed in some way, and we can discuss it in a more coherent way in this other document. And so it was a way to drive those two documents to completion and still be able to say, but we can have the discussion that people want to have over here in this document after we're done with the main two documents. That dumping ground seemed like a good plan to have.
Right. And thank you for saying that. I didn't quite want to, I was struggling with the term for that. Right. There are three types of typical issues that we want to triage today because they will inform the charter text proposal. And one set is on the mailing list. There were discussions of various recommended SMTP extensions that should be mentioned. And what I would like right now is for us to discuss whether they should be must implement, should implement, can be mentioned, or not mentioned at all. We have 4 of them. If we can talk about them one at a time, that would be great. If people have opinions, please come to the mic. So starting with time.
Victor?
Quick one, pipelining, it's just a performance optimization, so I don't see it being mandatory to implement. There is some history of it being implemented incorrectly. I'm not sure that much can be said about that other than implement it correctly. I don't know if there's clarifying information that would help people do that. The spec read carefully is clear enough, but it has occasionally led to problems, and we've had to work around it from time to time. 8-bit MIME, however, does feel like something that's at this point can be reasonably required if the overall consensus is that we can do that. Not having it just causes pain in encodings that break DKIM and so on in mid-transfer. And so it would be good if 8-bit MIME were universal, in my view. Yeah.
All right, any more comments, especially about 8-bit MIME? Jim?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this was the complete list or if there are additional extensions that are suggested. But
it's not an exhaustive list. People can suggest other things. This is just the most common things that came up.
Okay, I would put start TLS there.
Fine. Yeah, sounds good.
Any other strong opinions on any of these for must or should or don't mention?
Yeah, there was quite a big discussion on DSNs and stuff like that. If I can just quickly talk as a participant, I think enhanced reply codes is really a no-brainer. They should always be used and implemented. So I would class enhanced reply codes in a similar bucket to 8-bit MIME actually. So I would really like to see this being recommended.
Yes, and I'll also speak up as a participant for SMTP.
Do people still hear me?
Hearing Seth.
All right. If do people still hear me? Can you people confirm? I think I lost audio for us. Right. If there are no more comments on this, let's talk about the next topic. Terminology. There are various set of roughly related issues. John talks in G11 about SMTP client and servers, senders and receivers, how this changed in 5321 and whether they should be rolled back to the earlier terminology. There is also discussion about, do we need to define terms like MUA, MTA, MSA in this document? So if you have comments, please come to the mic. Harold? Harold seemed to disappear. Anybody else? Harold, if you can talk first, and then Victor after you.
Okay, did you hear me?
Yes. Yes, I think I can hear you now, so I suspect other people can do as well.
Okay, so the point I was trying to say is that if we use the terminology in 821 and 822, then we cannot put it in the applicability statement because we need it before it's ready. If we don't use it in the 821, 822 things, then we should have it in the applicability statement. So usage defines.
Good point. Victor?
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that is that by reference to 5598, it sounds a pretty good idea to me where it's not required in the core document, but is something additional words in the applicability statement should probably reference rather than redefine 5598.
All right. Any other comments? John? John, try again. Right. Anybody else? John, it doesn't seem like we can hear you. So if you like to maybe type your comment very quickly. Okay, John, try again. This might be a rather dull session if nobody can talk. 's Victor?
I just wanted to test that John is the only one having problems.
I think not just John, but there were several people having problems. So yeah.
Okay.
But at least I can hear you. Pete,
And,
go ahead.
And you can hear me as well? Yeah, again,
Yes.
Okay.
Minutes ahead of schedule, so this is a good time to speak up.
Yeah, Pete, if you want to come back and say something, you can.
No, I was literally just making sure that audio was still working.
Right. Yes, Victor?
Are we still going to talk about 5321 biz and specific items, or did I miss the opportunity to?
There are more specific items. There are follow-up slides.
Okay.
Well, I mean, a lot of according to chairs, a lot of issues rate land and seem to be more applicable for applicability statement. That's why they're in this section, basically.
Right. No, I had a couple of items. I don't know if they'll make it into the slides on that. I think go in BIS, but when we get to the topic again, I'll.
You probably can have a quick few minutes now.
Well, so I had two issues that are raised on the list. I'm not sure if they got noticed or got traction. One is that we have this 552 to 452 thing. That's kind of a sore spot in 5321 that I would like to see corrected. That turned out to be a disaster, and we quickly yanked the treating 552 as 452, and postfix certainly does not do any such silly thing. But the spec tells us to.
I believe John has an issue for this one. Yes. Sorry, carry on.
Okay. And the other one was I also asked about 554 greetings. I'm not sure if that got recorded. The sort of a question as to whether that's a message level failure or a try another MX, response, and that could be clarified.
Right. These issues seem to be like for 5321 BIS. Yes.
Okay.
All right.
If we have time at the end and want to talk about specific issues, actually, in other words, start doing the work of the working group, that would be fine. As AD, my preference would be to converge on the charter on this call.
Right. We have time.
The rest as time allows.
I have been seeing a lot of these 421 issues with, for example, Gmail returning 421 for specific email for specific user, and Sendbell treat this as, okay, go to next MX, don't send anything to that domain anymore because it's shutting down, and which is really annoying. But if you try to manually send the next email, it goes through if it's for the different user or something like that. So I think it needs clarification for the error codes, what to do with those.
All right, thank you. Let's move on to another sort of typical issue that might or might not end up in email applicability statement. So IP address is literal in a hello. Would people like to talk about this? John?
I think we have to allow it in hello because it's used in submission from devices that don't have names. I would be perfectly happy to have it go away from mail or receipt. I think sending mail to hosts that don't have names was a bad idea in the 1980s and has only gotten worse.
Who's next?
Victor, go ahead.
So mostly what John said. The only thing is that on port 25, right, not submission, if you're using address literals in hello, expect friction. I know there are some strong feelings about folks who say that you're then, in cardinal sin and it's taboo and so on, but that horse has left the barn, and so ELO address literals will be discriminated against.
Victor, Keith.
Yeah, I'm pretty firmly against a prohibition on IP address literals in mail and receipt because there's a lot of things that use SMTP that aren't connected to the public internet. And I think there's a general problem that we have in IETF is to assume that our protocols are only for use on the public internet, and that doesn't really match reality. So I think we need to recognize that the scope of this is wider than that. So that's the short version. I should probably write a draft for the longer version. Now, how do I get the microphone to go away?
And kill it from this end. Thanks, Keith.
Thank you.
John, you are actually on the audio side. But can we hear you? Guess not. Dave, you're up.
So I will also suggest that there's a difference between what is acceptable practice in the public internet versus what needs to be allowed in the protocol engine, and that there are environments in which it is convenient and safe to use IP address literals, and in fact maybe the only viable choice because they don't have or don't want the rest of the infrastructure. That's different than the public internet, and that's fine. And so let's distinguish between, I shudder to say this given my earlier posting, the applicability restriction in the public internet versus what the protocol engine allows.
All right, thank you, Dave. Anybody else?
Minutes ahead of schedule. So I know we had some things at the back. We might want to pull them forward.
How much time ahead of the schedule are we?
And we actually had another 5 of padding if we needed it, so it could be about 15 minutes ahead.
Right. Okay, let's take another issue then. Resolvable fully qualified domain names and private domain names. There is a text in 5321 saying that only resolvable fully qualified domain names are permitted in SMTP. So one of the questions, in addition to the ones on the screen, is do SMTP servers have to try to resolve all domain names to verify they're resolvable before they use them? Is it even a good idea? And any other comments people have on this? Keith?
Same comment, or kind of same comment as last time. I don't think this should be a restriction imposed by the SMTP protocol. I think there are contexts in which you might say only public, fully qualified domain names are applicable here, but I don't think it should be strictly aligned with SMTP.
Right. Okay, thank you, Keith. Victor?
I think resolvable is too strong a requirement, so that could move to applicability to explain that you should ideally use resolvable names, but certainly the protocol should not absolutely require it to be resolvable. As for fully qualified, I think again it's a question of clarity. It should be as qualified as makes it unambiguous between sender and client. In other words, don't strip off components and send only part of the name, whatever you think the name is. The whole name. Send the whole name, and that's what fully qualified means to me. It doesn't imply anything about the DNS per se, rather that you just shouldn't arbitrarily truncate names, assuming that that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think it means in this case that you cannot just have a single component local names. Right, Pete? Pete, you're next.
Let's try now. There we go. Victor significantly shortened my comment, but I think this is the ideal case of get it out of the protocol document and into a separate applicability statement where you could describe where it's reasonable to use non-fully qualified domain names, whatever that might mean, where it's reasonable to use non-resolvable ones, etc. That's what the document, this kind of document should be doing, and the protocol document should be clear about what the syntax is to use it otherwise.
Sounds good. Anybody else? Okay, well, John, hopefully you can talk this time.
Yeah.
Yay!
Maybe.
Yes, you can.
Just an observation about Keith's comment. Unfortunately or fortunately, ICANN decided to allocate a few thousand new top-level domains. And fortunately or unfortunately, when we did 5321, we decided it was okay for them to have MX records. And as a consequence of that, we cannot prohibit single component domain names because they may be FQDNs. Whether we should have introduced years ago the possibility of domain names into email with trailing periods like the DNS spec allows is a separate issue, but I suggest that adding that feature now might cause more problems than it's worth.
Right. Okay, let's go. I'm not sure who was first. I'll let Keith first.
Yeah,
and John, you can stay on the line, John.
I actually kind of disagree with John. I don't care what ICANN does with single facet top level domain names. We're free to disallow them in email, and we should.
Well, I think we're free to disallow them in email. The difficulty is that when we did 5321, we made an explicit decision, parenthetically over my objections, to allow them and to allow MX records there. So for the last umpty years, this has been explicitly valid, and I don't see how we can invalidate it without getting ourselves into trouble, much as I'd like to.
All right, Victor next.
Yeah, on the topic of single label FQDNs with MX, they're dead on arrival. They're not going to be interoperable. Nobody's using them currently. We can, even though the DNS allows publishing of MX records there, they won't work in internet email. So we should say so.
Right. John, the other John.
I have actually been tracking the MX records in the root zone for a couple of years, and I can confirm that John is correct. There are a bunch of MX records, and Victor is correct. They don't work. So I think we would be doing the world a favor to say that was a mistake and don't expect them. We don't allow them and don't expect them to work.
All right, sounds good.
We should probably take this to the mailing list, but for whatever it's worth, that decision would make me personally very happy.
Okay, and Bron disappeared from the queue. So Dave.
So my understanding is that with the creation of TLDs for organizations and the like, there is a move to permit MX records and the like in TLDs. So I think this is another case of distinguishing between what protocol engines should allow or not allow versus what operational practices might be at a given time. We shouldn't bake in operational practices that might actually be, we shouldn't bake in prohibitions into the protocol engine against practices that actually are quite reasonable in a technical sense, but might not be operationally permitted now, but then tomorrow they might be.
Sounds good. Right, I think now we are moving on to the exciting review of Charter. Okay.
Great. So just as a recap, we've been over this before, but the intention of this work is not to do major surgery, but to move these documents to internet standards and use the applicability statement as a way to simplify 53221 bis and 5322 bis. If we can delete things, great, but we're only looking to add things if they're clarifications. And we want to make sure that the applicability statement reflects modern practices. But to the extent we can keep 5321 and 5322 changes minimal, that's the absolute intent here. Barry or Alexi, do either of you have anything else you just want to say before we jump into the charter text?
No, you covered it well.
Great. No, Barry, go ahead. Okay, then Alexi, let's jump into the charter text. And so I'm not going to read this out loud. This is context. But again, if anyone has anything they want to discuss, we've got plenty of time for the charter. That's the purpose of this box. So please come to the mic queue.
Just to clarify, the charter is on 4 slides. The last slide we're likely to drop. So if you don't have comments on this one, let's concentrate on the meat, which is the other next 2 slides.
Okay, so Alexi, let's go to the next slide. And Alexi, I think you were going to cover this one.
Yeah, so this slide is basically talking about we are going to follow process in RFC 6410 for moving documents to internet standards, limited review restrictions, corrections, clarifications only, dealing with errata and describing that it's verified errata or errata marked as held for document updates. The working group may consider newly offered errata. And then the other important bit is no protocol extensions or amendments will be considered. The current text suggests until their standards track RFCs already. Comments, please. And Pete?
Yes.
Ooh, Pete, Pete, are you still there?
Yes, I accidentally clicked myself off. So the only complaint I have about this bit is already published as standards track RFCs. I think this clearly needs an addition of published as standards track RFCs that are eligible to move to internet standard. I don't want arguments about, well, we should really include this and it's in a standards track RFC unless that standards track RFC is dead clear that it's already widely deployed and interoperable and could move to internet standard itself. It shouldn't be included in 5321 bis and 5322 bis.
All right, thank you, Pete. Dave?
So going off on this reference to standards track RFCs, it occurs to me that that for including references to standards track, the kind of concerns Pete is raising are really important for this work. On the other hand, it also excludes informational RFCs that might be worth incorporating, and that doesn't have the maturity concern that this does, but they're being excluded sort of arbitrarily in the charter.
All right. Dave, I will encourage you and others who think that a specific informational RFC should be considered for inclusion to bring this up on the mailing list.
So I'm not trying to suggest specific RFCs right now. I'm trying to suggest that the charter should not be written in a way to eliminate that option.
Right. I initially had concerns about this standards track as well, and I had a couple of documents in mind. When I looked at them, I realized that one of them is already internet standard and the other one is proposed. So yes, we can relax this. Will it help us? It probably will slow the working group down.
I don't know. I think the right wording here might be unless they're already at a sufficient maturity level to be to move to internet standard, and that should cover us.
Okay.
Informational documents don't move to internet standard.
Well, so unless they are of already of sufficient maturity to be considered as internet standard, or some text like that. When I say maturity, I don't mean the formal maturity levels in the IETF sense, but we all know what a mature spec is and what isn't.
All right, Pete.
I want to reinforce what Dave said here about informational, because the presumption is if one of these documents refers to an informational, it's going to non-normatively reference it, right? It may point to a document that is informational that fills in a gap, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. The idea of the charter is to limit stupidity in part. And we definitely want to be able to say, no, we're not including things that are random proposed standards, but we don't want to preclude making an informational reference to some informational document that really is well understood and well accepted. and it's never going to be at a level that is considered internet standard. It's just a sufficiently mature informational document. We want to put in some limiting instructions here, don't get me wrong, but let's not get overly excited about particular maturity levels or something like that.
All right. Do you think the text needs to change?
I think we can come up with something slightly better.
Fine.
Yeah, and I think potentially taking what Barry, Dave, and Peter said, we could probably do all of this with just saying, however, no new normative protocol extensions or amendments will be considered unless they're at a sufficient maturity level to move to internet standards or something like that.
Something
Yes.
like
I think
that
we can
would be fine. Yes.
Yeah, I think we can thread that needle in the charter text and make sure Dave's point is handled, but also keep the bar very high for anything someone wants to fold in.
Right. Thank you.
All right. Sounds good. Any other comments on this slide?
And actually, before we move on, Dave, does that meet your concern if we use language like that?
Probably. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So the slides talk about the applicability statement, BCP, or BCP. It will be documenting widely deployed work, and which is already documented. So you cannot just include something which is not in RFC already or not described anywhere. And it should reflect current email practices. Comments, please. Yes, Pete.
To address something Dave said earlier, maybe some text in here making it clear that this document is not locked with 5321 bis, 5322 bis, or that we're working on the protocol specs first, and this will be published after, even though we're going to be dumping things into here at the same time.
Point taken.
Thanks.
Any other comments?
Well, the final bit is and current email practices. I'm concerned that lacks some specificity that might open some doors that would slow us down, but I'm not certain how to address that or if anyone else shares the concern.
All right. If there are no other comments, then we are basically nearly done. There is one more slide. Basically, several people suggested that we don't need to say this. I think I would like to ask ISG and our area director about whether this text should stay or not. But basically, it's saying the intent is we deal with these three documents, and if we are successful, we will tackle other work like revising MIME specifications and other things. Basically, it's restricting scope and saying that we intend to do future work if we are successful with the current slate. Ben.
Am I still media?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I have a mic icon. Isn't this always true?
It is true, but some people were concerned that we're trying to, this is all we're doing, and you'll never be able to do anything else again, kind of thing. So
I don't have strong feelings there, but it's always seemed odd to me when working charters say things about you have to recharter to do things when we can always recharter to do anything.
Right. Pete?
Yeah, Dave made a similar comment on the list, and while I tend to agree that this particular item is utterly superfluous, you know, charters do have a social aspect to them, and one of the things that we've already sort of heard inklings of on the list is people who think that their extension that needs to be dealt with immediately, and the answer is we're not shutting you out. We're simply saying that it gets done later after we get this stuff done. And I don't think it's bad to say such a thing, but it is completely fluff.
Absolutely.
And Barry, before Tira.
Yeah, I guess I can shut down because Ben and Pete basically said what I was going to. I think it's useful to have this in there, but yeah, it's redundant or superfluous.
Right. Tiro?
We have had similar things in IPsec ME, and I think it's one of the good things about that is it gives the expectations of what the working group is supposed to do, and it also gives you the idea that yes, after these 3 documents, while we are working on these three documents, we are not taking any other work. After that, we can start working on other things. So it's people are expecting to, okay, we might start working later. This is not working group that does this and shuts down.
Thank you. And I'm of a similar opinion that I think it's worth the signpost, even though it's obvious. There's lots of other work that might come out of this. And to say we do intend to look at this other work and we'll make decisions about it explicitly feels valuable in the charter, but purely from a signposting, let people know we are going to look at other proposed work, not that. You know, the general case that of course we can take on more work later, but that we intend to take on more work later. But this is the rest of the charters want the scope immediately.
All right. Any other comments? I think we're a bit early and we are at the end of our agenda. I think we only have 1 slide left after this.
Yes, we have about 15 minutes left. So I think what Barry had said earlier is once we're at the end of the charter, we might even look at some of the work, or we could probably break early. But does anyone here have a strong opinion about do we want to actually dig into things, or do we want to, does anyone have any items they want to address with respect to the charter or the scope of work we've discussed so far?
Well, let me throw in one thing here. So let me ask somebody, are there any objections to a charter approximately along these lines? Does anyone think we should not proceed with this? And while we're waiting for people to ring in for that, I'll ask the chairs, do you have a sense of when I might expect to get this charter on my e-desk?
Our discussion today is making me hopeful that there are only like 2 sentences or 3 sentences that need changing. So it can be like next week.
Anyone ring in to object? So carry on with getting started with the issues.
So if people want to talk about any other issues in 5321, I do have sort of like, I don't have extra slides. I can project agenda which has mentioned a few other issues. So if people
Actually, Alexi, before we dig into the issues, can you go to the last slide?
Yes, yeah. And actually, this is more of a question for our AD as well. So basically, we with our AD need to figure out whether this is going to be a separate mailing list or not.
Will absolutely be a separate mailing list.
Fine. I'm very happy for you to short circuit this. And then just if people want to discuss SMTP extensions, they should still use IETF-SMTP@IETF.org, which is what we were using for discussing the charter. So Barry will get the mailing list set up for us.
Non-working group mailing list as soon as I can get that requested, and that will be the working group mailing list when the working group is chartered.
Okay.
So I believe there was an earlier conversation between Vladimir and Pete that we cut off for time. Vladimir, Pete, do either of you want to come back to the mic? Pete has raised his hand, so go ahead.
Yeah, I think, and I think Victor was the one who brought this up. I don't think there's any harm in bringing all of those sorts of suggested clarification kinds of issues to the list to sort of put on the docket of things we have to figure out whether they go in or not. I don't think it's worth discussing any one of them here. I think they're all pretty straightforward. It's more a question of, do they belong in the document or not?
Got it. Thank you, Peter. Pete, wow, it's way too early for me. I apologize.
Yeah.
Victor
More coffee,
and
man.
Pete. Yes. Victor, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I don't know that I originally stepped the mic. I noticed that there was the suggestion to add star TLS as a required extension, and certainly most of my work on SMTP in the TLS space. But one thing I wanted to get a feel for is, how strongly do people feel about setting floors and tracking IETF recommendations on the latest, preferred version of TLS. If we include TLS as a required extension, do we then start saying things like you must do at least TLS 1.2 or else the world ends? In SMTP, what I find often is that folks will insist on very stringent TLS, and then when it's absent, say, oh, well, I can't do TLS, let's do clear text instead. That'll be more secure. So I would like to see a little bit of sanity prevail, but I know the issue gets contentious when one tries to say that in this protocol, the usual requirements about, minimum versions and, absolute security and so on can be relaxed. And so, we need to be a little bit careful about how we go about that. I would say something like barring cross protocols attacks support all reasonably, currently in use TLS versions, even if they're deprecated elsewhere. But some folks may be strongly opposed to such radical ideas. But TLS opens a can of worms because unlike this very stable specification, it keeps changing on us from time to time and causes bit rot. And I don't know how we deal with that.
Victor, if you haven't raised this issue on the mailing list, please do raise it.
I will.
So that at least we can track it.
Mm-hmm.
Jim?
Hi, I guess I'm on.
Yes.
Thanks. In response to Victor's comment, yeah, I've kind of got the same dilemma regarding Start TLS. I mean, there's just a whole slippery slope of things that you could require there. So I guess my feeling is at this level we should require or at least advise the implementation of the Start TLS extension, but I wouldn't get a whole lot more specific than that. I mean, it's a good idea, but I mean, there's if you're not since implementations currently are typically not verifying the certificates, or as Victor points out, they're frequently falling back to clear text anyway. There isn't a whole lot of security benefit in being very specific here, as far as I can tell.
All right. Any other issues people would like to? John?
Yeah, with regard to the TLS issue, I think a pointer that says there's a strong recommendation in a non-normative pointer that says there's a strong recommendation that that all this stuff be encrypted would be entirely appropriate. But if we start making it a requirement, we're going to open a whole series of cans of worms, some of which have been mentioned, and the other is the rather complicated problem that despite current IETF recommendations, there are still complex issues about the trade-offs between link encryption and relay vulnerability versus end-to-end encryption, which we've never figured out a way to solve in a way which would hide addressing information. So again, I think an informational and recommendation and AS or BCP pointer here might be reasonable, and we should discuss it, but a normative requirement reference, I think, gets us into deep trouble. And I want to note for anybody who hasn't been noticing that there's been a thread in the Jabber room which may be relevant to several discussions we had earlier.
In relationship to this, would anybody want to relay any of the comments made in Jabber earlier? Okay, Bron, Bron?
Yeah. Yeah, there were comments certainly about the single component domain parts. John talked about that quite a bit in Jabber, and I think everyone came to the same agreement on it, but maybe it's not particularly well documented in the notes yet. Maybe I better go back and fix that. That the low-level substrate should not specify that you can't have single component parts, because not only are they used a lot in in-house setups, but they have been made legal in the past. But certainly, again, we could, in the advice, say you shouldn't be using all these things on the public internet, even if they are allowed by the low-level technology. I think that covers most of what was said. We shouldn't start denying things or making things illegal that we have allowed in the past, but we should certainly say we strongly recommend against using these parts in public.
All right, thank you. Anything else? If not, you can have your 6 minutes back.
Yeah, on the other hand, one of the things we should put in our queue somewhere is that if we're going to allow these single component names, that we go through both documents and make certain that all of the text about short names and abbreviated FQDNs be taken out of there, be out of there. I hope it's out of there already, but I don't have much confidence in it. And this interacts with some of the comments very early in the section about 5322 requirements.
I think it also affects the ABNF.
Yeah, no, it does, absolutely.
Right.
So again, no specific comments, but we should definitely give ourselves an action item to very carefully make that review.
Yeah, point taken.
Okay, I think we are at the end of everything. Any final thoughts, Alexi or Barry?
Barry appeared and disappeared.
In that case, I think we're at the end. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Pete and John, for leading the discussions of your documents. And look for a new mailing list in the next couple of weeks. Oh, Barry?
Yep. And thank you guys for chairing.
See you online.